Basidiomycotina. Basidiomycetes are also known as club fungi. They are the most advanced and the most commonly seen fungi. Their fructification are often large and are clearly visible with our naked eyes. The term Basidiomycetes is given because of its reproductive structure, which is known as basidia, and this structure produces spores that are known as basidiospores. Basidiomycetes are also among the best decomposers of woods. For example, Ganoderma. And some examples of Basidiomycetes include rust, smuts, mushrooms, puffballs, and last but not the least, self fungi. Now, as you can see on the right hand side of the screen, there is an example of a mushroom that is known as Agaricus muscarius. So, moving on to the next slide. Structure of Basidiomycetes. Number 1. The cell wall is always chitinous. Number 2. Motile spores or structures are absent, as we all know. And number 3. The plant body is multinucleate, septate, and also have branched mycelium. There are 3 kinds of mycelium. Number 1, primary mycelium. So, primary mycelium occurs with the germination of a uninucleate basidiospores, and this basidiospore will carry either a positive or a negative strand in them. So, generally the cells are uninucleate, but after the fusion of 2 compatible hyphae, these cells become binucleate. So, basically, if a basidiospore germinates, then this basidiospore will give rise to a mycelium or a hyphae, and this mycelium or hyphae will contain either a positive or a negative nucleus in them. Number 2, secondary mycelium. So, secondary mycelium originates from the primary mycelium itself, and that is because after the fusion of the 2 hyphae carrying 2 opposite strains in them, the nucleus of one hyphae travels to another. Later, it gives rise to the secondary mycelium. So, in simple words, when 2 mycelium meet each other, that is 2 basidiospores meet each other, then they fuse together and then they form the secondary mycelium. Number 3, tertiary mycelium. So, the secondary mycelium grows extensively under the soil and it becomes organized into special tissues to form the fruiting body or the basidiocarp. The fruiting body appears like an umbrella above the ground and it is made up of dikaryotic hyphae, and these hyphae are known as the tertiary mycelium. Moving on to the next slide. General characteristics. So, as you can see on your screen, there are almost 5 to 6 characteristics. So, number 1, as we all know, Basidiomycetes produces sexual spores that are known as basidiospores, which are produced on a special structure known as basidium. Number 2, on that basidium, 4 basidiospores are produced. Number 3, basidiospores are haploid and are uninucleate. Number 5, clamp connections are present on the mycelium. Number 6, dolipore septum are also present. Now, you must be wondering what is clamp connection and dolipore septum, right? So, let's move on to the next. Clamp connection. Clamp connection is a structure that is formed due to the growing of the hyphal cells in a fungi. Basically, it's a hook-like structure that is meant for the bypass of a nuclei, because this nuclei cannot pass through the septal spore, that is the dolipore septum, and as the nuclei passes through it, it helps in the multiplication of many dikaryotic cells. It also creates genetic variations in many sexually reproducing species. So, moving on to the next slide. Dolipore septum. Dolipore septum are also known as septal pore, as we all know. These are specialized dividing cells that is present in a cell, and ultimately these structures divide the cell within the hypha. These structures have a barrel shaped swelling around its central pore, and around its central pore there is a membrane which is known as the parthenosome or the pore cap. You can see on the screen there is a diagram given. So, this structure allows the movement of mitochondria, cytoplasm, etc. across the hyphae. Moving on to the next slide, reproduction. In Basidiomycetes, both asexual as well as sexual mode of reproduction takes place. First of all, let us look into asexual mode of reproduction in Basidiomycetes. Now, Basidiomycetes can reproduce asexually by two means, that is, first is budding and second is by forming asexual spores. Now, budding occurs when an outgrowth of the parent cell is separated into a new cell, and asexual spore formation occurs in specialized structures known as conidiospores. Moving on to the next slide. Sexual reproduction in Basidiomycetes. Number 1. As we all know that no sex organs are involved in the formation of Basidiomycetes. Number 2. Basidiospores are produced on specialized structures known as the basidium on the gills of that specific fungi. Now, this basidium are formed by plasmogamy, that is the fusion of two somatic cells. These basidium are arranged in special fruiting bodies known as the basidiocarps. For example, like agaricus, that is a mushroom, now puccinia, that is a rust fungus, and usteligo, that is a smut. Moving on to the next slide. Nutrition. Basidiomycetes are generally saprophytic, that is, they obtain their nutrition from dead decaying matter. For example, from dead decaying woods, from dead decaying leaves, and soils that are enriched with dead decaying matter, etc. Moving on to the next. Basidiomycetes is divided into three classes, that are class number 1, Teleomycetes, class number 2, Hymenomycetes, and class number 3, Gasteromycetes. Moving on to the next slide. Class 1, Teleomycetes. Teleomycetes is a class of the Basidiomycetes fungi that do not produce the basidiocarps. That means if there is no basidiocarps, there are no basidiospores. So, instead of basidiocarps, teleospores are produced, and this teleospores ultimately germinates into the basidia. It consists of the most important pathogens such as smuts, rust, etc. So, this group contains two orders, that is order number 1, Uredinils, and order number 2, Usteligenils. So, on the right side of your screen, there is an example of the class Teleomycetes, that is the Puccinia oxalides. Moving on to the next slide. Structure of Teleomycetes. Number 1. As we know now that Teleomycetes produces teleospores instead of basidiospores. Number 2. The septa of the species are very simple. Number 3. The mycelial hyphae is septate. Number 4. This species do not produce any fruiting body, but it does produce fruiting structures. Moving on to the next slide. General characteristics of Teleomycetes. Number 1. Teleomycetes are characterized by thick wall. Number 2. Basidiocarps are absent, as we all know. Number 3. Basidium arises from a thick wall structure known as probasidium. Number 4. These teleospores are produced on a structure known as teleutosauri on the host tissue. Number 4. In smuts, the spores are known as chlamydospores, and in rust, these spores are known as teleospores. Moving on to the next slide. Reproduction in Teleomycetes. Asexual reproduction in Teleomycetes are very much uncommon. So, let us move on to the sexual mode of reproduction of Teleomycetes. So, number 1, in smuts, Haploid sporedia are bud off into daughter cells, then karyogamy takes place, and due to which the probasidium is formed. The resting spores produce the promycelium, into which the diploid nuclease moves in. After meiosis, 4 haploid nuclei are formed. This results in the formation of haploid basidiospores. Moving on to the next slide.
Now the first order is uridinales. Uridinales is commonly known as the rust fungi and it is an obligate parasite. It actually causes local infections in the above the ground parts of the plants. A famous example of uridinales is Puccinia malvacearum. The general characteristics of uridinales is that they produce reddish brown colored spores. They form on the surface of host stems and leaves in pustular outgrowths. They do not produce any fruiting bodies and usually involve 5 kinds of spore forms. Thus, their life cycle can be termed polymorphic. On the left hand side, we can see the picture of Chronartium rubicola. It is an example, famous example of uridinales. If we come to the next slide, we will see that there are 5 types of spores that are produced. Namely, first one is pycnospores, that is the spermatia. Second one is aciospores. Third one is uridospores. Fourth one is telutospores. And fifth one is podia, that is basidiospores. Now, if we come to the type of rusts, there are 2 types of rust. There is autoecious and heteroecious. Now, what do we mean by autoecious? Autoecious is actually they just grow on only one host. A famous example of autoecious rust is hollyhock rust. And the scientific name of hollyhock rust is Puccinia malvacearum. Now, if we come to the second type, that is the heteroecious rusts, they actually grow on 2 unrelated hosts. A famous example of heteroecious rust is white pine blister rust, and the scientific name of white pine blister rust is Chronartium rubicola. We can also divide rusts into 2 other groups, that is the macrocyclic rust and the microcyclic rust. Macrocyclic rusts are actually heteroecious rusts which produce all spore forms on 2 unrelated hosts. Right? A famous example of the macrocyclic rust is Puccinia graminis. They also show demicyclic life cycle. They do not produce any uridospores. So, and also the Puccinia graminis is also known as the black stem rust of wheat. Now, if we come to the microcyclic rust, microcyclic rusts are generally autoecious rusts whose all spores are formed on only one host, that is asparagus. For example, Puccinia asperagi. They actually show short-cycled life cycles, and telutospores are the only spore produced in the life cycle. Example is Puccinia malvacearum. Now, over here we can see the picture of Puccinia graminis. We can also see the reddish brown pustule-like structures over here. These are the Puccinia graminis. And over on the right hand side, we can see the Puccinia malvacearum. These spores, reddish brown spores that are formed over the leaf are the Puccinia malvacearum. Now, if we come to the reproduction of this fungus, we can see that the reproduction is actually established by spermatization between a positive spermatium and a negative receptive hyphae. In this type of reproduction, actually dikaryoticization also takes place. After that, if we come to the next order, that is Ustilaginales. Ustilaginales is also known as the smut fungi. They are actually serious plant pathogens, and only dikaryotic stage are the obligate parasite stages of this fungus. Now, if we come to the examples, the famous examples are Ustilago nuda. This causes smut of wheat and barley. And the second famous example is Ustilago maydis. which causes smut in corn or maize. On the left hand side, we can see the famous, the famous Ustilaginales example, that is Ustilagomades. Uh, this is the fungus over here. If we come to the general characteristics of Ustilaginales, we will see that they produce thick-walled resting spores, and the spores that are produced by them are known as chlamydospores. Development of mycelium is diffusely distributed all over the host. It is totally diffused and distributed all over the host. And they are parasitic on higher plants, as we already have seen in the earlier slide. And it causes leaf spots, which is broom, or known as the tufted growth, and galls, means swellings. Now, if we come to the structure of this Ustilaginales, we will see that it involves the copulation of two basidiospores. Content of one spore is transferred to another, and their nuclei do not join. A diploid cell is formed, and a mycelium and a binucleate bells develop from the diploid cell, which is capable of infecting the plants. If we come to the reproduction of this order, the development cycle consists of alteration of both haploid, that is the basidia and basidiospores, and diploid, that is the mycelium and chlamydospores phases. The most significant phase or the stage is the diploid phase. It begins with copulation of basidiospores and ends with reduction division in nucleus in chlamydospores.
Next class is Hymenomycetes, which includes more than 20,000 species around the world, and the most distinguishing feature of this class is that they have a well-developed basidiocarp. They include mushrooms, bracket fungi, borer fungi, coral fungi, etc. Coming to morphology and anatomy of this class, they are characterized by exposed spore-bearing layer called hymenium. They are composed of membranes which may be fleshy, woody, or gelatinous, and they have a dolipore septa which is surrounded by a membrane structure called perindysome. They are mostly saprophytic, feeding on dead wood, and rarely parasitic, feeding on insects. They reproduce either through sexual or asexual means. Sexually, through the production of basidiospores, where the spores are born on basidia, and when the spores ripen, they either fall on the ground or they are carried by the wind to a host where they germinate into a mycelium and develops into a full-grown mushroom, or they produce asexually through the production of odia. This class is again further classified into two subclasses solely based on the septation of Basidium. They are Phragmobasidiomycetidae and Holobasidiomycetidae. Subclass 1, Phragmobasidiomycetidae. Here the basidium is a Phragmobasidium, that is, the basidia is divided into 2 or 4 cells divided by a septum. They are also known as heteromycetes and are classified as jelly fungi or rust fungi and smut fungi. Their morphology and anatomy are as follows. The fruit body here is very simple, and the basidia is divided by a transverse or longitudinal septum. The dolipore septum is surrounded by a perindysome, and the basidiospore here is capable of producing secondary spores. They are mostly saprophytic, feeding on dead plants and decaying woods, and they also reproduce either through sexual means, that is through the production of basidiospores, or through asexual reproduction through the production of odia. This subclass has 3 orders, namely Dreamellales, Auriculariales, and Septobasidiales. Some of their important characteristics are, for the order Dreamellales, they have a longitudinal septate basidia, and they have digyrotic hyphae with dolipore septum. There is presence of clamp connection, and the fruit body varies in size. They are mostly saprophytic. For the order Auriculariales, they have a transversely septate basidia, and the fruit body varies in size and also in shape. There is a presence of clamp connection, and they are also mostly saprophytic. For the order Septobasidiales, they are mostly parasitic or have a symbiotic association with scale insects, and the basidiospores germinate directly on the insects. Let us see some examples for each order. For the first order Tremolales, the first example is Tremella mesenderica. This species belongs to the kingdom Fungi, division Eomycota, subdivision Basidiomycotina, class Amenomycetes, subclass Phragmobasidiomycetidae, order Tremolales, family Tremolaceae, and genus Tremella, and belongs to the species Mesenderica. Some of the important characteristics for these species are they are commonly known as witch spotter. The fruit body here is irregular in shape, and there is presence of clamp connection. The basidia here is cruciate septate, and it is either diagonal or vertical. They are mostly saprophytic and reproduce either sexually or asexually. Asexual mode of reproduction is through the production of gonidiospores, and sexual mode of reproduction is through basidiospores. Another example under this order is Pseudohypnum gelatinosum. It belongs to the kingdom Fungi, division Eomycota, subdivision Basidiomycotina, class Hymenomycetes, subclass Phragmobasidiomycetidae, order Tremolales, family Exidaceae, genus Pseudohypnum, and species Gelatinosum. Some of the important characteristics are they are commonly called as tooth jelly fungus, and they are brownish white and mildly velvety. They are flattened tongue in shape, and the basidia is longitudinally septate. The fertile undersurface is covered with soft pendulum whitish spines. They are mostly saprophytes, feeding on decaying woods, and reproduction is solely through sexual means, through the production of basidiospores. Under the order Auriculariales, the first example is Auricularia auriculatridae. It belongs to the kingdom Fungi, division Eomycota, subdivision Basidiomycotina, class Hymenomycetes, subclass Phragmobasidiomycetidae, order Auricularies, family Auriculariaceae, genus Auricularia, species Auriculatridae. Some important characteristics for this species are they are commonly called as jelly ear fungus because they form an ear-shaped fruit bodies, which is then brown velvety on the outside and shiny on the inner side. The gills are sausage-shaped with white spore print. The cylindrical basidia is divided into 4 cells through 3 transverse septa. They are usually saprophytic that feeds on decaying wood or organic material, and they also solely produce sexually through basidiospores. Another example under this order is Exidia glandulosa. It belongs to the kingdom Fungi, division Eomycota, subdivision Basidiomycotina, class Hymenomycetes, subclass Phragmobasidiomycetidae, order Auriculariales, family Auriculariaceae, genus Exidia, and species Glandulosa. Some of the important features are the fruit body is gelatinous, lobed and brand-like. They become crust-like when dried, and they also have clamp connection. And the basidia is longitudinally septate, spore sausage in shape, and they are smooth. They are mostly saprophytic and reproduce either sexually or asexually. Asexually by the production of conidia, and sexual through basidiospores. Next order is Septobasidiales. The first example is Septobasidium pseudopeticillidum. It belongs to the kingdom Fungi, division Eomycota, subdivision Basidiomycotina, class Hymenomycetes, subclass Phragmobasidiomycetidae, order Septobasidiales, family Septobasidiaceae, genus Septobasidium, and species Pseudopeticillidum. Some important characteristics are there are smooth-shelved fungi with fully developed and thick wall hypobasidium. The fruiting body is divided into 3 layers, namely subculum, pillars, and hymenium. They are mostly parasitic, feeding off the scale insects. and the basidium is tapered with sterigmata and pores. Another example under this order is Septobasidium cauligonges. It belongs to the kingdom fungi, division Eomycota, subdivision Basidiomycotina, class Hymenomycetes, subclass Phragmobasidiomycetidae, order Septobasidiales, family Septobasidiaceae, genus Septobasidium, and species Cauligonges. Some of the important characteristics are they are brown to dark brown in color and have smooth surface. The basidiomata are on branches, and basidia are directly arises from the hyphae. They are mostly parasitic, feeding off scale insects.
Now I am going to talk about hollowed Basidiomycetidae. It falls under the subdivision Basidiomycotina and another class Hymenomycetes. It is a substantial mushroom. Next, its morphology and anatomy. This subclass of fungi are coincided to be mushroom and have a stalk and a fleshy cap. This subclass of fungi have aseptate basidia, exposed pore surface. This subclass has 6 orders. They are Exobasidiales, Brachybasidiales, Dacrymycetales, Tulasnellas, Exobasidiales, Aphylophorales, also known as Polyporales, and Agaricales. Nutrition. This subclass of fungi are mostly saprotrophs and parasites. Reproduction. Karyogamy, is nuclear fission, occurs by the basidiospores, and through meiosis, basidiospores are formed. Conidia are produced in asexual reproduction.
Example includes Lycoperdon pertellum and Cyclocybe parasitica.
Moving on to the order Exobasidiales. Exobasidiales are an order of fungi in the class Exobasidiomycetes. About its morphology and anatomy. Basidia develop in a layer on the outer surface of the infected host tissues, often protruding from stomata or from between epidermal cells. Nutrition. Nutrition is basically parasitic and pathogenic. Exobasidiales are obliquely parasite and pathogenic on vascular plants lacking basidious carbs. Reproduction. Reproduction is by sexual spores, that is basidiospores.
Examples Exobasidium camelli and Exobasidium vexans.
Now moving on to the order Dacrymycetales. The Dacrymycetales have basidia in which the distal end of the hypobasium bears 2 divergent epibasia. Now morphology and anatomy. Dacrymycetales is a widely distributed genus, but its fruiting bodies are rarely 2 to 3 mm in diameter. That is, the fruiting bodies are very small. Fruiting bodies are yellowish to orange in color and hemisphere to subhemispherical in shape. Nutrition. Nutrition is mostly of saprophytic type. Reproduction. Basidiospores, when discharged from a basidium, it divides transversely into several uninucleate cells, which gives rise to a mycelium. Sometimes the basidiospores buds off several conidia. The mycelia developing from a cell of a basidiospore is haplophasic. The diplophase has not been determined. Mycelia in artificial culture may produce numerous conidia.
Examples Calocera cornea and Dacrymyces cupularis.
Now moving on to the order Brachybasidiales. Not much information has been found in this order, but the Brachybasidiales contains a few small or monotypic predominantly tropical genera that cause leaf spots. Brachybasidium species occur on palmae.
For the order Agaricales, they are also known as gilt mushroom because of their distinctive gills. They are characterized by bullet-shaped caps and black spores, which makes the gills appear black, but some of the species may or may not have gills. Majority of them are edible, a few are somewhat poisonous, and some are mildly toxic. One important feature of this order is on maturing, they liquefy, forming an inky mass. For example, under this order, we have Agaricus augustus. They belong to the kingdom fungi, division Basidiomycota, class Agaricomycetes, order Agaricales, family Agaricaceae, and genus Agaricus. Next example, we have Agaricus campestris. They belong to the kingdom Fungi, division Basidiomycota, class Agaricomycetes, subclass Agaricomycetidae, order Agaricales, and genus Agaricus. For the order Aphilophorales, also known as polyporales, they are saprophytic. Most of them are wood rotters. Some genera, such as Ganoderma and Fomes, contain species that attack living tissue and then continue to degrade the wood of their dead hosts. They are commercially cultivated and are marketed for the use of food items or in traditional Chinese medicine. For example, under this order we have Ganoderma aplanatum. They belong to the kingdom Fungi, division Basidiomycota, class Agaricomycetes, subclass Incertidae, and order Polyporales, and genus Ganoderma. For the next example, we have Polyporus tuberasta. They belong to the kingdom Fungi, division Basidiomycota, class Agaricomycetes, order Polyporales, family Polypораceae, and genus Polyporus. For the order Tulisnellales, they are also referred to as jelly fungi because of their distinctive jelly-like structure, also known as heterobasidiomycosis. They are species of wood or litter-rotting saprotrophs. They are ectomycorrhizal association. It means they associate with trees and other plants such as orchids. For example, under this order we have Tulisnella eclairiana. They belong to the kingdom Fungi, division Basidiomycota, class Agaricomycetes, order Cantarellales, family Tulisnellaceae, and genus Tulisnella. For the next example, we have Tulisnella viola. They belong to the kingdom Fungi, division Basidiomycota, class Agaricomycetes, order Cantarellales, family Tulisnellaceae, and genus Tulisnella.
Under Basidiomycotina, after the class Teleomycetes and Hymenomycetes comes the class Gastromycetes. This class consists of more than 700 species. The basidiospores mature inside basidiocarp. The basidiocarps are both epigynous as well as hypogynous. The morphology and anatomy. The gastroid fungi forms visibly diverse fruit bodies called basidiocarps. These basidiocarps are thin, crust-like, gelatinous, cartilaginous, and sometimes fleshy. These basidiocarps form basidiospores, which are developed internally and reach maturity, although they are not discharged forcibly. The basidia are typically formed in layers called hymenium. The mode of nutrition of gastromycetes is saprotrophic for almost all the species. The mode of reproduction is sexual reproduction, which results in the formation of basidium bearing the basidiospores. These basidia are borne on fruiting bodies, basidiocarps, which are large and conspicuous in all but the yeast, rusts, and smuts. This class Gastromycetes has 9 orders, namely Podosales, Phallales, Hymenogastrales, Lycoperdales, Gautierales, Tulostomatales, Nidulariales, Melanogastrales, and Sclerodermatales. First, order Podosales. Podosales are also called pouch fungi, in which also the spores are colored. The morphology and anatomy include the fructifications, which are epigynous or stalked or angiocarpic. The gleba or spore matures on the inner side of the centrally stalked cap. The basidia at first is a true hymenium. The stipe is long or short, continued to the apex of the fructification as a columella. The peridium is simply 2 to 3 layered at maturity. The mode of nutrition is saprotrophic and mode of reproduction is sexual reproduction. The first example is Cortinarius porphyroideus. This species is commonly known as purple pouch fungi. The smooth surface of peridium is sticky. The young fruits are white, which grow below the ground and develop further above the ground, turning from white to purple. The second example is Chirofragmium californicum. It is a lesser known species, and here the cap-like structure is the expansion of the stem, which further splits open to release the spores. The next order is phallales. This order are also called stinkhorns due to their distinct odor. The morphology and anatomy of stinkhorns. A stem-like structure grows from the egg and carries at its tip a cap of spore-bearing tissue. The gleba is usually mucilaginous at maturity and surrounded by the receptacles lying between the exterior of the cap. This cap secretes a putrid-smelling slime which attracts flies, and these are responsible for spore dispersal. The nutrition is again saprotrophic, and the mode of reproduction is sexual reproduction. The first example is Phallus impudicus. It is also known as the common stinkhorn. It is recognizable for its foul smell. The second example is Pseudocolus fusiformis. The fruit body here is different. It is column-like, and the cap here is not distinct and lacks hymenium. The olive brown structures inside it are the spores. The next order is Hymenogastrales. This order includes species that are intermediate in structure between Hymenomycetes and Gastromycetes. The morphology and anatomy of Hymenogastrales. A sterile columella is the main feature of many species under this order. The fructification is hypogynous, pulp-like. The stem-like columella is rare, and the peridium remains dehiscent to maturity. The gleba of one or more cavities and hyphae holding the original structure till maturity. The peridium and gleba are essentially fleshy, not cartilaginous, and conidiophores, when present, are borne in hymenium with the basidia. The nutrition again is saprotrophic, and the mode of reproduction is sexual reproduction. The first example is Hymenogaster sublilacines. It is hypogynous and lacks a well-defined columella. The rusty brown structures are the spores. The second example is Psilocybe semilanciata. It is also commonly known as the liberty cap. It is evenly distributed species, and the cap is conical. Hymenium is adnate and has gills. It is saprotrophic. Sometimes it is also used in medicinal purposes for depressive disorders.
Now the next order is Nidulariales. Nidulariales is also known as the bird's nest fungi, and the fruiting bodies actually resembles the tiny eggs filled inside the bird's nest. Coming to the characteristics of Nidulariales, Nidulariales has a gasteroid fruiting body. That means the spores actually develop internally, right? And the next one is the gregarious fruiting bodies they have. The fruiting bodies actually grow in groups. The third characteristic of Nidulariales is that they have small fruiting bodies containing disc-shaped peridioles that resembles the tiny eggs, and this fungi is generally inedible. Coming to the nutrition of Nidulariales, it is generally saprotrophic in nature, feeding on decomposing organic matter, growing on decaying wood, and also found in soils enriched with wood chips or bark mulch. Now, if we come to the reproduction of Nidulariales, it has fruiting bodies which develop and produce peridioles containing the basidia, upon which new basidiospores are made. Young basidia contain a pair of haploid sexually compatible nuclei which fuse. Resulting diploid fusion nucleus undergoes meiosis to produce basidiospores, each containing a single haploid nucleus. Now the famous example of Nidulariales is Crucibulum cyantiform. The taxonomic classification of this Crucibulum cyantiform is, its kingdom is fungi, division Basidiomycota, class Agaricomycetes, order is Agaricales, family is Nidulariaceae, and genus Crucidium. The next example is Cyathus striatus. This is the picture of Cyathus striatus, and if we see inside, these are the peridioles. Now the taxonomic classification is: kingdom is fungi, division Basidiomycota, class Agaricomycetes, order Agaricales, family Nidulariaceae, and genus Cyathus. Next order comes as Melanogastrales. These are also known as the false truffles. It just looks like truffles, but these are not truffles. These are also non-poisonous. The first example of melanogastrales are Melanogaster tuberiformis. It is actually an underground fruiting body that produces basidiocarps. If we come to the classification, taxonomic classification of this, it comes as kingdom is fungi, division Basidiomycota, class Agaricomycetes, order Bulletails, suborder Taxillinae, family Melanogastraceae, and genus Melanogaster. The next example is Melanogaster variegatus. It grows in the deciduous forests, especially under oak and hazelnut. The taxonomic classification of this is kingdom goes under fungi, phylum Basidiomycota, class Basidiomycetes, order Bulletails, family Taxillaceae, genus Melanogaster. Next order comes Sclerodermatales. Its fruiting body occurs on or below the ground, and typically it is more or less spherical in shape. The spores are released via splits in the peridium. Example of sclerodermatales are Scleroderma verrucosum. It is sometimes called ground balls just for its shape. As we can see over here, it just looks like balls. Now, the taxonomic classification of this example comes as kingdom is fungi, division Basidiomycota, class Agaricomycetes, order Bulletails, suborder Sclerodermatinae, family Sclerodermataceae, genus Scleroderma. Next example comes as Scleroderma citrinum. It is sometimes also called as pigskin poison puffball. Now, the taxonomic classification of this example comes as kingdom is in fungi, division is Basidiomycota, class Agaricomycetes, order is Bulletails, suborder Sclerodermatinae, family Sclerodermataceae, and genus Scleroderma.